Well, here we are again, another Sunday morning. We are reading White Magic by Alice A. Bailey. We are on Rule 4. If you have a book, it's page 145. We're just going to touch on a couple things that were gone over last week, and then we're going to move on to Rule 5. So the reason I want to go back through this is because this is really the whole process in a nutshell. And it may or may not look like it, but when the evolutionary process for mankind is here. So I'm on the bottom of 145 where it says we have touched upon two words of significance in the fourth rule, sound and light. And one paramount idea emerges. The soul is to be known as light, and the revealer, well, the spirit aspect will later be recognized as sound. So if you're going to look at it from an evolutionary state, light is less significant than sound. Okay. Because the light is down on lower levels than your sound, in as much as he's connecting the spirit aspect as being related as sound. So if you're looking at your chart, that spirit aspect in its purer forms is up on the top. And that is directly related with sound, of which light is the manifestation of it on lower planes. Complete light and illumination is the right of the disciple who attains to the third initiation, whilst the true comprehension of the sound of the triple Om, the synthesizing factor, is manifestation appears only to the one who stands master of the three worlds. Because your third initiation occurs on the mental plane, but you do not have mastery of all of that at that moment in time. You are just allowed to enter into understand the triadal triangle of the next three above it. So the synthesizing factor in manifestation appears only to one who stands master of the three worlds. So you need to be above it at that point in time. The word vibration must next engage our attention, but it may not be disassociated from the next word in sequence, meaning form. So now we are connecting vibration and form, of which we're running around with a form. So is a slug, by the way. And I used that for a purpose, because in here we'll talk a little bit more about that. Vibration, the effect of divine activity, is twofold. There is first the effect in which the vibration issuing from the realm of subjectivity in response to sound and light. So that's the inner world. Produces response in matter and therefore attracts or calls together the atoms out of which molecules, cells, organisms, and finally integrated form can be built. This affected the aspect of vibration is to be noted as a duality, which we know in consciousness we have to have both sides, spirit and matter, in order to create the consciousness. The form through which the medium of the five senses becomes aware of the vibratory aspect of all forms in the environment wherein itself is a functioning entity. So the form with the five senses is the functioning entity in an environment where there's forms, okay, of which again we are one. Later in time and space, that functioning form becomes increasingly aware of its own interior vibration. In other words, it starts to turn subjective. And by tracking back that vibration to its originating source becomes aware of the self, and later of the kingdom of the self. Humanity as a whole is aware of its environment, and through the information conveyed by the sense of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, the phenomenal world, the outer garment of God, is known. And communication between the self and what we call the natural world is set up. And again, we're looking, you do not get anything in if it doesn't come through your senses. Okay. I mean, if you run into a brick wall, it's only, you know that because your senses have told you that there's this impact. Okay. In other words, we are so inundated with phenomena that we think something's going on all the time. Actually, it's the noise. They call it signal noise, and most of our world is noise. But it's not necessarily having any real input that the senses can process, other than just, babble, if you will. As the mind appropriates and synthesizes this knowledge, the dweller in the form passes through the following stages. And these are the stages that I wanted to talk about, because this is the process of becoming. It is the process that leads you through all of your initiatory activity. This is the process that takes you up that entire chart. And it's pretty basic. Vibration is registered and the environment has its effect upon the form. So if you talk about a slug and it moves until it touches something and it doesn't necessarily want to be there, it will back away. Okay, and that in itself is vibration registered, and the environment has its effect upon the form. So that's a very early stage of this process. This effect is noted but not understood. The man, under the slow, steady impact of this vibratory effect, slowly wakens to consciousness or awareness. The environment begins to interest man, and he regards it as desirable. Steadily, the attraction of the three worlds grows and holds the man in reiterated incarnation. The word reiterated is literally and more academically correct than the word repeated. Each of us is really a reiterated word sounding in time and space. So we never leave it. We might transition back and forth between being in form and not being in, and then retreating to the soul again, or being drawn back to the soul. But that is the reiteration of the word, and sounding in time and space. And so it's that entity that the soul has indicated it wants, it needs a reincarnation to learn more, to develop more, et cetera, round out its being or whatever its issues are. And so consequently, a form is built by two, I won't always say consenting adults here, but in other words, the form gets built. And then but the driver of all this and the essence of this is that soul now working with that form in terms of the reiterated word. And that's where when you have a sense of right and wrong, so on and so forth, it's evaluated by the entire history that you've had prior that is part of that soul. So in that regard, we come back and we are looking at it's the same reiteration over and over in terms of the connection. So, it's not a, in quotes, stranger. You're not born as a stranger every time. The inner part of you, the subjective part of you, is still there, just working and gathering more vibrations. You go back to Annie Besant, one of the first places where she says you're here to collect all the vibrations on a given plane. Then when you have done that, you will go through the initiation stage for that plane. And the physical plane is first, that's the first initiation, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's sounds, it's vibrations, but in most cases, on the lower level, it's the vibrations. Later, when the vibration of the environing forms of the natural world become monotonous, meaning they get bored, you're bored with them now. And why? Because you have heard them over and over, and those are the ones that Besant says you're collecting. And when you've, one of the best things I ever heard was, it was a student, a young man, and he said, I listen to a song until I've got every note in it, and then I'm not interested in it anymore. And I thought that was about the best description of what is being said right here. And he didn't have this background. It's just that's what he's doing. When he listens and he hears those notes, he's only interested in them till he's got every one of them. And the minute he does, then just like here, the natural world becomes monotonous through constant impact. In this case, over many lives, the man begins to turn a deaf ear and an unseeing eye upon the familiar, phenomenal world of desire. So that is the process of what we do. You do it, you do it, you do it, and then you're not interested anymore. You've hit your saturation point, and on you're going to move. He becomes insensitive to its vibratory impact and increasingly aware of the vibration of the self. And so the insensitive to that vibratory impact is what that self is looking for, because as we've talked about before, until you are an integrated unit that's going to operate as one, and you cannot be pulled back to earlier stages of development, the soul is not interested in any direct contact with you. Okay. Because it's not looking to be pulled down. It's looking to pull this vehicle up. So this level of consciousness, this little vehicle can be equal to the level of consciousness where the soul resides, so that they can have an exchange, and fully conscious exchange. And then the journey that the soul is interested in going forward with can occur. Prior to that, he's stuck on that third plane of the mental plane until this vehicle can pull all of this up to make the connection. So later on the path of probation and discipleship, the subtler vibratory activity exerts an increasing allure. The outer world ceases to attract. The inner world of the self assumes paramount place in the desire nature. So here is the shift where you're not necessarily chasing everything there is out there anymore. You might not be making more money, doesn't matter. Quality of life starts to matter, because the quality is attached, that word is attached to the soul. In other words, it's the quality of who you are that eventually matters. Okay. And so when we talk about the outer world ceases to attract, the inner world of the self assumes the paramount place in the desire nature. So then there's your question of, do I chase some phenomena that's out here, or am I now making my interest in my direction that I want to pursue the inner subjective world, and working your way to making that connection with the soul. And little by little, using the language of modern psychology within the outer form, which is the response apparatus for the process of becoming aware of the phenomenal world, the disciple builds a new, subtler response apparatus whereby the subjective world can be known. So now you have made a shift, and you're building, actually, I mean, this is, people have talked about this, you know, you feel these different parts of you getting ignited, or, you know, lighting up, or like, and there's other material which talks to you more specifically about setting some brain cells active, and you know, doing the chakras. So then the shift turns from the outer world of action to an inner world of developmental action. When this stage is reached, there ensues a steady turning away from vibratory contact with the outer worlds of form, and an atrophying of desire in that direction. Okay. All seems arid and undesirable, and all fails to satisfy the ardent and aspiring soul. The difficult process of reorientation toward a new world, a new state of being, and a new condition of awareness is set up. And because the inner subtle apparatus is only in an embryonic condition, there is a devastating sense of loss, a groping in the dark, a period of spiritual wrestling and exploration that tests the endurance and steadfastness of purpose of the aspirant to the very limits. Now, that occurs, but I would say that if you have these books and this material, because everything it's all in these books, okay? That whole journey is here. If you want that journey, you just keep reading these books, because it's written in here and it will get built in, and that occurrence will happen. So, so I'm not sure you have to go through as much of the dark night as others would if they don't, if they're just doing it blindly. It's a natural occurrence eventually, but by the same token, so is that process. So basically he's saying, look, you've got this outer world that's really well developed now to the form and the phenomena, and that's been going on for eons of time and necessary. But now we're going to go to an inner shift, and the body for that is not built. It has to be built. And in the process of building it, it probably looks pretty empty and non-functional, and wonder what's going on. And that's where he's saying there, when he's saying the new state of being and the new condition of awareness is set up. And because the inner subtle response apparatus is only in an embryonic condition, there's a devastating sense of loss, a groping in the dark, a period of spiritual wrestling and exploration that tests the endurance and steadfastness of purpose of the aspirant to very limits, because the aspirant is pretty basic when we use that term. So he's just turned around and is heading back, you know, so to speak. He's heading internally, but he's got not much to work with in terms of apparatus is going to give him feedback until it gets built. And so there's a lot of that stage. Certainly one of them is, did that really happen, or did I just imagine it? Okay, etc. So lots of phenomena happens in there, but you don't know whether you're just imagining it, because we do have imaginations, and we've practiced them earlier on stuff that can't happen, but we can imagine it. you know, and might like to have it happen, but we know it's not real. You know, it's just, in fact, it's very interesting. My grandkids, when they were 4, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there, they would ask me, now, is that real? It would be something on the TV. In other words, is that a picture of real nature, or is that a fantasy? Because they were learning that they could be very close to each other now, but they wanted to discern the difference. Okay, and so that's kind of a poor example, because it's got more substance than I am talking about here, because this stuff starts going on and you're still battling with, you're very well anchored in the physical phenomenal world that you've been in, where everything's pretty tangible, and all of a sudden this stuff's not tangible anymore. It comes into your head, into your mind, and then you have to figure out whether it's real or not. And you have no basis for figuring that out at that point. There's no ability to judge on your own. And you sure can't go to anybody else, because, you know, unless there's somebody who's had similar experiences or something. But everybody's experience is going to be a little different, because they've got different race structures. So you can't even count on that. So, yeah, they go a little bonkers. Yeah, unless you've got somebody around. I know my daughter, I think she was 17 at that point. She was having a certain degree of awakening, and she realized, this is going to sound, this is how crazy it's going to sound. She realized that she was in her car, she was driving, and she knew she was not seeing through her eyes. She was seeing, but she was not seeing through her eyes. Okay. See, that's how crazy this stuff sounds. And everybody would say, oh, she's imagining it or whatever. But that was not the case. So unless you've got people around you, and I know she, my mentor at that point in time, because she interacted with her and they had conversations about it. Of course, we did indicate to her this was probably not the time to be driving. And she was not doing drugs, so it wasn't that. It was, but she has more advanced vision also in general. That's just part of her development. So anyway, but that's how crazy things sound. And anybody who you ask who isn't on this journey, you know, will shoot you down for sure, which might make it even more so like that dark night of the, I don't know that that's really the dark night of the soul, but there's probably different versions of that comes along at different stages. But, and this is the encouraging point to be remembered, all proceedeth under law, and naught can hinder now the work going forward. And that's pretty key. In other words, you've gotten into the channel, the tunnel, the slot, whatever you want to call it. You've gotten that far, is what he's saying at that point. And then it proceedeth under the law, and nothing can hinder the work from going forward, because you have at that point, which he's described here as having shifted, and the reorientation and the new state of being, this is on the page before, and the new condition of awareness is set up. The response apparatus isn't too strong yet, but having made the connection and the focus for the direction, is what he's saying here, is that at that point, then you have gotten to a point where all proceedeth under the law, and nothing can now stop the work from going forward. Note these words in Rule 4. There comes a stage when a man is verily and indeed founded on the rock, and though he may experience the alteration of light and shade, though the waves of the purifying water may roll over him and threaten to sweep him off his feet, and though he may feel himself deaf and dumb and blind, not can ultimately defeat the purpose of the soul. So they're really probably connecting then that link to that soul, which has finally gotten a grip that it's been wanting. All that is lacking is the developed spiritual body, which is equipped to respond to the vibration of the inner spiritual world. So now that's what gets built. And it's going to proceedeth under the law, and not can hinder it from going forward. And so it isn't so much of what you do or try to figure it out, because it isn't. This is not a matter of trying to figure it out. It is a matter of becoming. And then you'll know what this or that or something else is like or about. Okay. But because you'll be in the process, and it will all be revealed to you in its time, in the order that it is set to occur. So it's a waste of time to figure out what this or that is going to be like. It's the doing of it that's going to get you there. And that's the only thing that's going to get you any answer that's worth anything, is your own experience. So it exists in embryo, and the secret of its use lies in the attitude of the brain to the functions of the etheric body. So that's where your connection has to occur, because you're going to build consciousness up through the mental plane. But once you shift over, that's not what you're doing anymore. You're going to be dealing with the functions of the etheric body as it exists as an intermediary between the brain, the nervous system, and the mind, or between the soul, the mind, and the brain. This cannot be elaborated here, but the hint we can be given for the reflection of the keen aspirant. And we have, therefore, the following stages dealt with in Rule 4 and pointed out with lucid clarity, yet with that parsimony of phrases which distinguishes all occult and symbolic writings. The integration of the form as a result of the activity of the soul through the use of sound, light, and vibration. So we are talking sound, we know, is on the top. Light is, he talks about the soul being connected, which would be the middle point, and vibration is your physical form and your lower three. The development of a response apparatus for use in the phenomenal world, that's what you need to do. And it takes time. It like he said, it's going to proceed under the law. If you can make that initial connection, it is going to occur. A lot of it, once you have shifted, and he's indicating, I don't know where it was, maybe it's in the beginning of 5. None of this can be done until you hit the mental plane. So he's really talking about that third initiation, which is why masters consider that the first, is because that is when you made the connection for this journey to really be able to occur. And so the development of a response apparatus for use in the phenomenal world, the eventual turning away from the phenomenal world as a result of use and consequent satiety, and the gradual use of the subtler response apparatus, the response apparatus of the soul, the mind, the etheric body, the brain, and the nervous system is reoriented, and man becomes aware of the kingdom of the soul, another kingdom in nature. The turning away from the kingdom of the world to the kingdom of the soul becomes an esoteric habit. And that is what will happen. It just is a habit. It's so built in and so strong at that point that that's the pull. And in this thought lies hid the secret of the esoteric psychology. The man is stabilized in spiritual life and not can now hinder. And that is the journey that these books are dealing with, and that is the process, and that is the order in which it needs to occur, and it's a description of what occurs, because you're just refocusing. I'm not going to deal with the breath. I'm sure that that is very accurate. My only reservation on not doing it is at the time you are working on this and getting yourself to this point, becoming very effectual on sending your thought forms out there might not be exactly what you want, because you're going to get back whatever it is you think you want. So it depends on what level you are when you start creating this. I mean, we do have a lot of people running around wanting to manifest, and they manifest and they don't know, they get what they asked for. I mean, it's an old classic saying, be careful what you wish for because you might get it. And you know, the soul isn't even the one that determines where you're born when an incarnation comes, because its perspective is not wide enough. So I'm hinting that maybe the individual, as he starts pursuing this range, doesn't have a wide enough perspective to know what he's asking for either. And more likely than not, it's going to be something lower level, because that's where he's been spending all his time. Up to this point is getting up to this point, but that's where his focus is saturated. It's still stuff, it's still things, it's still material. So if you got really good at the science of breath and are sending these things out there, they probably would come back to you in whatever version your mental capacity had. So now we're over to Rule 5, which is page 157. Do you, any questions, anything like that here before I jump to this next chapter? Oh, you got the whole thing, huh, Tom?
Well, it just, a lot of it really resonated. I mean, it's just, I kind of see some of that when I reflect on myself and just, you know, letting go and giving up a lot of the, I guess for lack of a better term, creature comforts that we get used to and things like that, because it's about searching and moving towards something a lot higher and more meaningful than the things that are created for us down here. So yeah. I'm sure I'll read it again in a couple weeks and I might have questions at that point, but a lot of it resonated, especially considering just what's been going on with me recently and things like that. So it's just, in a way, confirming and comforting to hear it and be able to associate it with things that have been going on. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're challenging yourself to decide which direction you want to really head, which direction you want to head in at this point in time.
Right. And then reading this, it's like, it's confirming, oh, okay, yeah, this is where I'm going.
Right.
So,
but it's your choice, in other words,
right.
but you've been offered opportunities which can lead you in the other direction too. Right. And so you've had to choose.
Yes. So it's very interesting and coincidental. There's really no coincidence, but it's just interesting to see it in words after having just dealt through it. So
yeah. Donnie, anything?
It seems like this world is for the soul, for souls, not for these little personalities that we've got running around, and we just haven't gotten, we haven't realized it yet or something, you know, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, this has been the process though. You did have to have the physical intelligent activity, if you will, the production of the first solar system, which gave you the matter to work with. And now it's the union of spirit and matter was what creates the consciousness all the way up. And it's like having to do the work down on these lower levels to get the development of the consciousness literally up to the point where it's on that chart. We're going to talk about the chart, hitting up on that mental plane level 3. That's been a long, long journey, and it's been the work. And most people don't have a real awareness of their soul. Okay, I mean, we've had the word thrown at us, so we can't forget it through eons of time, a reminder, hey, this is here. Okay, but as far as conscious interaction with it, that doesn't occur until you've built the consciousness up to that level, so that the substance we're talking about, the energy level, the quality of that energy is equivalent to what's on that level number 3, which is where the soul resides, so that you can have a conscious exchange and they become one. So you have full consciousness. It's like people will say, you know, I reached that level for a minute, but I couldn't bring it back. When I came back, I had to let it go. Okay, so they couldn't maintain full consciousness of that. That is the goal, is to get up to that level so that there can be continuing consciousness. And when that occurs, then jumping ahead a little bit, then the need to reincarnate does not occur. It's not a need anymore. It can be a choice. But prior to that, you don't have any choice.
It's like you say, you've said many times that it's like a nursery.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It feels like it too.
Preschool.
Yeah.
That resonates, you know, I mean.
Yeah, and it is, but you know now the direction of the journey. So you have, because it's always going to be a conscious choice that counts. Okay. You know, you can be in the direction of, you can be in the intent of. Okay, and that's the forming and the building of going there. And then there is the day when you actually make the conscious choice and your full activity level is behind it and supportive of it and not pulling you in any other direction. That's key.
Very good, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's good to.
I think Tom and I are both kind of dealing with some of that in a way. Well, I'm dealing with it in business right now, you know, and it's hard decisions.
Yeah.
Kind
you
of
look at it, you almost hit in every aspect of life. Yeah. But it's good that we make that clarification, that we clarified that, because you know there's probably people that struggle with the concept. If the soul's sole intent is to go higher, why are we even bothering with all this down here? Well, it's because you have to have that union of spirit and matter to build out the consciousness that you need so that you can kind of get there. So it's almost like it's a proving grounds, right?
Yeah, and on that chart 117, the little dotted line that goes up, you know, this is where we've built to so far.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's further to go. And even if you make that connection that he talks about, in fact, I'm wondering if this is where he indicates yeah, let me go through these first 3 points and then come back to this. We have been dealing with the process of creation as they concern the creator of a solar system or a planetary scheme. The ego, as it creates its body of manifestation. It should here be remembered that the entire human family has been brought into manifestation by a paralleling group of egos. Okay. And then man, as he creates those thought forms by which he expresses himself, through which he works, and by which he is surrounded. It should also be here borne in mind that this definite creative work is only possible to those who function on mental levels, the thinker of the world and the disciples of the masters. So we want to go back to talking about matter. Unprincipled matter is level 7 and level 6. Okay, there, that truly is where is the playground. You get the physical body and you get the emotional body. And that he'll talk about that. I mean, that is needed because it is the desire that you use that pulls all the rest of that up. That is the upper level of the astral plane, is the desire to go to the soul. You know, and that's the magnet that continues to pull you up as greater parts of you want to keep you where you are, because that is just natural. You know, that's not a nefarious activity. It is, you have substance, you've built a form, you have emotional nature, you've built it, and now there's a push to make them lesser important, and you're going to go up onto the mental realm, because the mental realm is the first realm where you've got principled matter, where, like I said, 2 and 2 is always 4. And so it has consistency, and it has substance and pattern that you can work with. That's not going to be, you know, like a mosh pit. And it principles, you've got something to hang on to here. Prior to that, you don't. You know, the astral plane, anything can be anything. And the physical, that change, yes, we have a planet, we have a solar system, but this planet certainly changes over eons of time. You know, so that's not permanent. Everest is not permanent forever, necessarily. Okay. There was a time probably when it wasn't, and there's a time now when it is, and who knows what this earth changes will go through over time. So the point is, man, as he creates those thought forms by which he expresses himself, through which he works, and by which he is surrounded, it should also here be borne in mind that this definite creative work is only possible to those who function on the mental planes, the thinkers of the world and the disciples of the masters, because you're not going to make any connection to what is above there without having had that third initiation, which opens the gateway to connecting you to the spiritual triad. And then you are going to build in the qualities of that energy into your body. And now you are working on a subjective level rather than an objective physical level. And become consciously aware of what is there and try to discern what that energy is saying, what its information is, what it's describing in terms of qualities that are on this planet. And any questions, or I'm going to go on here.
That's very subtle, right? And
It's subjective, so I mean, it's not tangible in form. Is that what you're asking me?
I'm asking if it's subtle, that when you're discerning this, I guess.
It's a different quality of energy. So yeah, and it's subjective, so it's not tangible. So you probably would see it as subtle because you're wondering if it's real. And the processes can go on once you get to that point without you being aware of it. He makes that very clear in other material, that you do not necessarily know what's going on. You're not going to be consciously aware of that in the process necessarily, as that gets built in. So just like he indicates, once you have gotten past the third initiation, definitely is not subtle because it occurs here, but he indicates that initiations after that, they don't even affect you. They're not bringing to you what the third or the earlier ones are attaching them to you in a way that you can't miss it one way or another. Okay. But that after that, they don't bring energy one directly to you because they're dispersed in a far more inclusive realm in subtler energies where it's goes to everybody who's functioning up in those realms. And that's its beneficence, if I could put it that way, streams on to humanity as a whole in the realms that it's in. Does that make sense to you? So you are not necessarily going to be conscious of it. He makes that very clear, that once you hit a certain point, you're here in form, but that does not mean that the development that's going on, that you're even consciously aware of it. So this indication that is made is that you may see something of significance. And if so, you can take note. It doesn't mean you're going to understand the meaning of it, because you won't, because it has a different, I want to say background. In other words, your life here, the background is the soul and the synthesis of everything you've experienced to date. So whatever you're doing, this now gets evaluated against that all the time. And we determine what's the meaning. Okay. So to one person, it means this, to another person, it means that, because their histories, their experiences, their synthesis of who they are has different, they're balancing the same thing off of different backgrounds. So the feedback they get, which is called meaning here. What does that mean? You know, or what did that mean to you? Or that's not happening up there. The soul is ready to let go of the causal bodies, because it's not going to be the one determining incarnations anymore. And there may or may not be a need for any incarnations anymore, unless one is coming down to help or serve, because you've had your experiences here if you've achieved that level. And you're working now in the spiritual triad, 3 different levels, and figuring out those energies, and that translated, what does that mean? You know, what does this energy say? What does it represent? What is it? What's there? And that process is, it will be faster. The slow one is the one we're in. Prior to that third initiation, because you're in energy that is not limited by the dense substance we have here. You're not having to work through that form. It's a subtler form. the subjective realm. Did that answer something?
Mhm.
Yeah, but you might not know it's going on. That's the other thing you have to realize. You can make that connection or work towards making it, but so much of this is subjective now that it's going on, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. In every case, we have seen the objective form has been the result of meditation on the part of the creating agency. We're the creating agency. A response from the material acted upon by the force generated in meditation, thus producing the building of the form and its utilization through sound. This is succeeded by the stage wherein the form is seen objectively and becomes a vibrant living entity. This is the Word made flesh. And thus do all forms, universes, men, and ensouled thoughts come into being. So that was the upper level coming down into getting forms. And now this fifth rule touches upon three factors which engage the attention of the creating agent before the physical form emerges into view on the exterior plane. These three, the conditions of the water, the safety of the one who thus creates, and steady contemplation. We will deal briefly with these three, and then we will consider the three factors which the disciple needs to relate if he ever aims to become an active, potent operator with the hierarchy. These are the eye, the heart, and the throat. The interpretation and significance of these rules can be carried forward along several lines. For our purposes, the one followed will be that relating to the disciple and his work, and will deal with his training in the magical work of the ego, as that ego occupies and employs a physical form. So here, this word ego and soul are interchangeable. So that if you looked at that sentence, when you talk about the magical work of the soul, as that soul occupies and employs a physical form, would be an interchangeable word that DK would use. These teachings are intended to be practical. They will emphasize the training and the discipline of the disciple, and scattered throughout will be found those hints and esoteric suggestions which, when followed, will lead the aspirant on to experiment and to experience of truth. And that's what I'm saying, is these books have everything that you need as far as guidance to get to where he talks about people going. Those who are not true aspirants will fail to recognize the hints, and thus will be preserved from danger and premature experience. Let us therefore take up three factors which engage our attention. Let us consider them from the standpoint of the human being who is creating thought forms, and not primarily from the standpoint of a solar creator or of an ego preparing to take incarnation through the medium of form. Two collateral thoughts are here of value. One is that the process of creating thought forms is part of the work done by every aspirant in the daily meditation process. If the student would remember that every time he sits down to his morning meditation, he is learning to build and vitalize thought forms, his work might assume greater interest. The tendency of most aspirants is to be occupied with their deficiencies in the work of meditation and their inability to control their minds, whereas both those aspects of their endeavor would be aided if they were to be occupied by profoundly engrossing work of thought form building. A secondary and less important thought is that as egos prepare to take human bodies, are deeply engaged in meditation work, it's highly improbable that they can be reached by the ordinary medium in the ordinary seance. At the most, only those who have passed over quite recently can thus be contacted, and they are, in most cases, in a condition of deep abstraction of a different kind. There is no time or purpose in enlarging upon this theme here, but it is of interest to those investigating these matters. So basically, he's saying if somebody has passed over, they're either contacted quite recently after they pass over, or they're in a condition of deep abstraction of a different kind. So as far as trying to have seances or mediums trying to contact them, he's indicating that the odds are it's highly improbable that they can be reached, are his words. So the condition of the waters. The creating agency, man, has, through the incentives of a coordinating purpose, intent, meditation, and creative activity, built the thought form which he is ensouling with his own vitality and directing it with his will. This time, the time has come for that thought form to be sent upon its mission and to carry out the purpose of its being. As we saw in the earlier rule, the form is driven from its creator by the power of the expulsive breath. This is a symbolic statement, but at the same time, an experimental fact in the magical work. In the disciples' work, there's often failure owing to his inability to understand both the esoteric and the literal significance of this expulsive breath as he carries forth his meditation work. The expulsive breath is the result of a preceding period of rhythmic breathing, paralleled by concentrated meditation work, then a definite focusing of the attention and the breath as the purpose of the created form is mentally defined, and finally, the vitalizing of the thought form by its creator and its consequent emerging into independent life and activity. So we are talking about a thought form that gets created, vitalized, and is sent out to live its own life. That's why I'm saying one should give some thought to the forms you're thinking, because they're out there and they'll be out there forever actually afterwards. The first hindrance to the potency of this work comes through the failure of the disciple to carry on these activities simultaneously. The second cause of failure lies in his neglecting to consider the condition of the waters or the state of the emotional substance into which this mental form must go, and so gather to itself the matter of the astral plane, which will enable it to become a functioning entity on that plane. If it cannot do this, it becomes simply and eventually a dead form on the plane of the mind, for it will lack the motivating power of desire, which is necessary to carry it forward to completion on the physical plane. It is interesting to remember this. If a thought form is sent forth into the emotional world to gather to itself a body of desire, the impelling force which produces all objectivity, a very substantial line, it is immersed in a condition of the waters, which can best be described as purely selfish. All that occurs is as follows: it is lost by being drawn into the astral body of the disciple, which is the focal point for all astral energy employed by the disciple. It is swept into a vortex of which the individual astral body is a center and loses its separate existence. The simile of the whirlpool is of value here. The thinker is like a man throwing a toy boat from the shore into a stream of water. If he throws it into a whirlpool, it is sucked in time into the central vortex and so disappears. Many forms thus constructed by an aspirant in his meditation work are lost and fail in their objective because of the chaotic and whirling state of the aspirant's emotional body. Thus, good intentions come to naught. Thus, good purpose and planned work for the master fail to materialize because as the thought form passes downward onto the plane of desire and emotion, it contacts only the seething waters of fear, suspicion, hatred, of vicious or purely physical desire. These being more potent than the little form, drown it, and it passes out of sight and out of existence, and a man becomes conscious of another abortive effort. Or again, the condition of the waters is not that of a self-engendered whirlpool, but is more allied to that of a pool stirred into a frothy and boiling surge through the activities of others. There are many disciples who have achieved a fair measure of self-control and of personal disinterestedness. They are not the victims of personality desires and aims and are comparatively free from the whirlpool of selfish tendencies, but their astral bodies are again and again swept into a state of agitation by the group for and in which they work. They are elated or depressed, satisfied or dissatisfied by the results they achieve or fail to achieve. This achievement or lack of achievement and the steadiness or disloyalties of their fellow servers produce agitation and emotional upset, and on this powerful reaction, their thought forms, constructed so diligently and prayerfully, come to naught. Their skill in action is lost because they are tied to the desired result, and so their labor produces nothing. There are many conditions of the water which each aspirant can for himself supply. There is one more, however, upon which I would like to touch. The emotional body of the disciple, which must be fed and nurtured the baby thought form in its mental nucleus, is necessarily part of the planetary emotional form and hence vibrates in unison with that form. This should also be carefully considered, for the emotional body is thrown into a state of activity by the general astral condition and must be handled wisely from this angle. At this time, there are three qualities predominating in the planetary form: fear, expectancy, and climaxing desire for material possession. Note the word climaxing, meaning the summation of human desire for material happiness has been reached and the peak of the desire has been passed. Thus, mankind has achieved and surmounted much, but the rhythm of the ages is strong, and that should be recognized, that it is strong. You know, it's ages, there has been the pull in that direction. And actually probably a relatively, when you get back into, we're moving back into the physical, astral and physical, of very stationary, well-established. So there's a strength even just in that. These three qualities have to be grasped and discounted by the aspirant as he seeks to serve from mental levels. In the place of fear, he must substitute that peace which is the prerogative of those who live always in the light of the eternal. And when I think about that, I think about going back to some of those stories that were written in Cosmic Consciousness in the back that were personal stories, and how when they had had the experience that they talk about, they don't have fear. And so in a sense, he must substitute that peace, which is the prerogative of those who live always in the light of the eternal. So I would assume, in a sense, they got a glimpse of that light of the eternal in their little epiphany, because it changed their life, and they were not fearful anymore because they understood everything was just the way it was supposed to be, in the eternal here and now. And so in the place of questioning expectancy, he must substitute that placid yet active assurance of the ultimate objective, which comes from a vision of the plan and his contact with other disciples and later with the master. Desire for material possession must be superseded by aspiration for those possessions which are the joy of the soul: wisdom, love, and power to serve, peace, assurance, and right aspiration. These three words, when understood and experienced in the life of every day, will bring about the right conditions of the water, which will ensure the survival of every thought form rightly engendered in meditation by man functioning as a soul. And taking note, this will ensure the survival of every thought form rightly engendered in meditation by man functioning as a soul. And so now there we're talking about the quality of the thought forms that should be engendered and sent out into the world. That would be constructive. So now we're talking about the safety of the one who thus creates. It might be said here with emphasis, even if it is in a recognized truism, that people are frequently slain in the occult and therefore in more important sense by their own thought forms. Worth giving some thought to that idea. It might be said here with emphasis, even if it is a recognized truism, that people are frequently slain in the occult and therefore in the more important sense by their own thought forms. Thought creation through concentration and meditation is a potentially dangerous matter. This must never be forgotten. There are forms of thought unencumbered by much desire matter, which failing to pass downward, poison the man on the mental levels. This they do in two ways: by growing so potent on the mental plane that the man falls a victim to the thing he's created. This is the idea fixe, in French I don't know well, of the psychiatrist, the obsession which drives to lunacy, the one-pointed line of thought which eventually terrorizes its creator. By multiplying so fast, number two, that the mental aura of the man becomes like unto a thick and dense cloud through which light of the soul must fail to penetrate, and through which the love of human beings, the lovely and the beautiful and the comforting activities of nature and of life in the three worlds equally fail to pierce. The man is smothered and is suffocated by his own thought forms and succumbs to the miasma which he himself has engendered. So, I think we've probably all seen people who kind of get stuck in their own idea and can't get out of it. Yeah. And that's a stage that mankind is capable of being involved. Or again, there are lines of thought which draw forth from the emotional body a reaction of a poisonous nature. A certain line of thought is followed by a human being in relation to his brethren. It breeds hate, jealousy, and envy, and works through into manifestation in such a manner that it produces those physical plane activities which cause the death of their creator. This may be literal, as in the case of murder, which is in many cases the result of a crystallized intent, or it may result in disease. Pure thought, right motive, loving desire are the true correctives of disease, and where the desire for these, which does animate many, is raised to constructive thinking, there will be a gradual elimination of disease. As yet, though many desire, few think. Let it never be forgotten that the great ones do not look for those who only desire and aspire. They look for those who blend with their desire the determination to learn to use their mental bodies and become creators, and who will work constructively towards those ends. Thus, it will be seen why, in all systems of true occult training, the emphasis is laid upon right thinking, loving desire, and pure, clean living. Only thus can the creative work be carried forward with safety, and only thus can the thought form pass downward into objectivity and be a constructive agent on the plane of human existence. You will note here the word meditation is not used in steady contemplation. The thought is a different one. The meditation process involving the use of thought and the mental building of the form so it can be completed and rounded out and in line with the thought form of the disciples group of co-disciples, and therefore with the plan, has been completed to the best of man's ability. Now he must, with steadiness, contemplate that which he has created, and with equal steadiness, inspire it with needed life so that it can fulfill its function. He ceases to reason, to think, to formulate, and to build in mental matter. He simply pours his life into the form and sends it forth to carry out his will. Just as long as he can contemplate and hold steady, so will his creation fulfill his intention and act as his agent. And so that'll be very key. It's as long as he can contemplate and hold steady. Because if he drops it, so to speak, mentally drops it, no longer holds it steady, it's going to fall apart. Just so long as he can focus his attention on the ideal for which he created his thought form and can link the form and the ideal together in one steady vision, just so long will it serve his purposes and express his ideal. Herein lies the secret of all successful cooperation with the plan. Because eventually that's where this is going also, is you move out of your own realm and you start cooperating with the planetary plan. We will now study for a while the words heart, throat, and eyes. And you'll notice those are all above the diaphragm, where they have particular significance. These three forms the apparatus to be employed by all disciples during the world cycle, which is so rapidly coming. That there is not as yet a very large body of disciples in incarnation at this time, and that the apparatus with many who are functioning on the level of discipleship is but an embryo is profoundly true. It should be remembered, however, that the world cycle has only just been inaugurated and will cover a vast period of time. There are only about 400 accepted disciples in the world at this time. That is, men and women who really know they are disciples and know what their work is and are doing it. There are nevertheless many hundreds out of the present generation of young people who stand on the verge of acceptance, and thousands are upon the probationary path. In all truly esoteric groups, there should be forming a group in which an intellectual understanding of this mechanism of heart, throat, and eye will be found. It should be constituted of those who are submitting themselves to a discipline and a training which will make its use a demonstrated fact in nature. I would call attention to those words and request their careful study. A mechanism in the natural body comes into use in two ways. First, its use is involuntary, and there is no comprehension of how or why or when the apparatus is used. An animal employs a mechanism analogous in many respects to that employed by man. He sees and hears and functions organically along similar lines to the human, but lacks the mental understanding and the linking of cause and effect, which are characteristic of the higher kingdom of nature. A similar state of affairs exists in the early stages of the path of discipleship and the final stages of the probationary path. The disciple becomes aware of capacities and powers which are not as yet intelligently under his control. He experiences flashes of insight and of knowledge which seem unaccountable and of no immediate value. Yeah, and take note of that, because those kinds of things will occur. And you may record them, but they seemingly have no place in the moment. He contacts vibrations and the phenomena of other realms, but remains unaware of the process whereby he has done it and is incompetent either to renew or recall the experience. Within his etheric body, he senses active forces. Sometimes he can localize them. And in any case, he admits theoretically that there is awakening into conscious activity as sevenfold structure, which is symbolic in form and potent when employed. He cannot as yet control it, and he is quite incapable of calling it into intelligent cooperation with his purposes and ideas, no matter how hard he tries. These are all earlier stages of the development of those subtler capacities that you're going to have. But you're going to go through the process of all of this. All that he can do is to register such phenomena, keep a record of these experiences, bearing always in mind that in the early stages of his unfoldment, only the coarsest and most material of the vibrations will be registered on his brain consciousness. And so that's very key to understand when you think nothing is happening. And that somehow you've lost it and, you aren't connected anymore. You got to remember that only the coarsest of the vibrations will be registered in the brain. He simply has to wait and to bring his mind to bear upon the purifying of his vehicles and the elimination of all that he recognizes as liable to distort his vision. So there can be a lot of things there that can distort the vision, and until that's eliminated, you're not going to see clearly. So this period may be long or short according to the aspirant is entering into the subjective consciousness for the first time or taking up the thread of an older or partially achieved undertaking. So that, in a sense, talks a little bit about something that we oftentimes use the word recapitulation. In other words, you developed it in an earlier lifetime, and now it's there for you to pick up again to further develop and to further solidify that quality. That's when he's saying this period may be long or short according to the aspirant, whether he is entering into the subjective consciousness for the first time or taking up a thread that he's developed earlier. That would be faster and quicker. I would like here to make perfectly clear to all true and earnest aspirants that in the training to be given during the next few decades, the unfoldment of astral vision and hearing will be entirely ruled out. So, if it exists, and it will eventually have to be overcome, the true disciple has endeavored to center himself on the mental plane with the object in viewing of transferring his consciousness higher still into the wider and inclusive awareness of the soul. That's your third initiation. But in other words, he's indicating the unfoldment of that astral vision and hearing will be entirely ruled out if it exists. It will eventually have to be overcome. So you are shifting off. I mean, there's a lot of argument right now about you, or at least there certainly was a few decades ago, that, oh, you don't have to go onto the mental plane. You can just bypass all this. And they may feel that if they're having experiences of what he's talking about here, astral vision and astral hearing, they may think that's complete. But he's indicating, no, that is not the case. The true disciple has endeavored to center himself on the mental plane with the object in view of transferring his consciousness still higher. And that transfer that third initiation has to occur. You can't skip it and go to the fourth. And I say that because if you were going to skip it and you go from 2 to 4, there's a channel there that could make a connection. But you do not have the functionality of the mental plane and then connecting up into that spiritual triad. That you need that mental, and you need to connect with that soul and have that consciousness, full consciousness across that. You're not going to get that if you were just working on the astral and thinking you could bounce up to the Buddhic plane. His aim is to include the higher, and there is no need for him at this stage to regain that astral facility, which was the possession, as you well know, of the little evolved races of the earth and many of the higher animals. So that makes very clear what his attitude is about that, the awareness of the levels of the astral plane. So you could have some very highly evolved entities drawing on information about these lower planes, in terms of being psychic or having astral vision or hearing. But that was the high point of that level of evolution. And he's making it clear here is that the faculty, his aim is to include the higher, and no need for him at this stage to regain the astral facility, which was the possession of the little evolved races of the earth. Okay. This one is now we're starting to move on to the mental plane and considered to be more evolved in process, as I'm sure down the line, they will indicate you don't need, far down the line, you don't you don't need to go back and have the mental function, because you will have been functioning on the Buddhic plane, which is the what is. It's just information as it is, without deductive logic needed to determine it. But in this case, he's saying, okay, we aren't looking back here and going through and developing all of that, because we're functioning on the mental plane. So later on, when adeptship has been reached, he can function on the astral plane should he so choose, but it should be remembered that the master works with the soul aspect of humanity and does not work with their astral bodies. This has oft been forgotten by teachers both East and West. In working with souls, the true technique of evolution is carried forward, for it is the soul within the forms in every kingdom in nature which is responsible for the developing work of and within the form. So that's why the soul indicates there needs to be another incarnation, because that's who's working with us little guys down here. Is you're not getting somebody on a higher level than the soul who is going to interact with the earlier incarnations that we are. Okay, the soul works it to a point where it gets it up to that third level and can make that connection, and then the link can be made to connecting with that triad, which then is the level where the masters function. But they're not taking someone, I mean, you could have somebody who deliberately incarnated to be of service or something, there may be a connection there. But as far as from what he's saying here, on your way up, if you haven't hit the third, it isn't the masters who are going to be connecting with you. So probably a certain amount of this channeling that's coming through, you know, of which you'll get series of books or something like that. It's not necessarily a master unless they've reincarnated for that purpose. It would be either some inner body of information that they have or something like that that gets channeled through, if you will. But he's making it very clear here that you have to be on that mental plane. You have to have gone through those levels for the master to interact with you. Because again, why would he? The soul isn't going to interact with you until you have an integrated personality. Why would a master? Yeah. In that regard. In working with souls, the true technique of evolution is carried forward, for it is the soul within the forms in every kingdom in nature which is responsible for the developing work of and within the form. May I say, therefore, to students that their main objective is to become aware of the soul, to cultivate soul consciousness, and to learn to live and work as souls. Until this time, as their use of their apparatus becomes voluntary, they would be well advised to train their minds, study the laws governing manifestation, and learn to include all that which we now cover by the word higher, a misnomer, but it must suffice. Secondly, when the use of the subjective instrument becomes voluntary, and a man knows how it should be employed, when he is using it and can discontinue to use or resume it at will, then his whole status changes and his usefulness increases. Through the use of the mind, humanity has become aware of the purposes and employment of the physical apparatus. Now, through the use of a still higher faculty, which is characteristic of the soul, He enters into voluntary and intelligent control of his instrument and learns to understand the purposes for which it exists. This higher faculty is the intuition. May I add with emphasis that only as the man becomes intuitive does he become of use in a master's group, and I commend all aspirants that they most carefully study the meaning and significance of the intuition. When it is beginning to function, then the disciple can pass from the stage of probation to that of acceptance in a master's group. You might here ask how this can be known or ascertained by a probationer. A great deal of training is given to a probationer without his really recognizing it consciously. Fault tendencies are indicated in him as he sees with sincerity to train himself for service, and the analysis of motive, when truthfully undertaken, serves amazingly to lift the would-be disciple out of the astral or emotional world onto that of the mind. It is the mental world that the masters are first contacted, and there they must be sought. But the time has come when the light in the head is not only present, but can somewhat be used. The karma of the aspirant is such that it becomes possible for him, through strenuously applied effort, to handle his life in such a way that he can not only fulfill his karma and carry out his obligations, but has sufficient determination to enable him to handle the problems and the obligations of discipleship. His service to others is carried out with the right motive and is beginning to count and make its power felt, and he is losing sight of his own interests in those of others. When this occurs, certain esoteric happenings take place. So they're basically indicating we've come to a point where we can do both, function and take care of business on the physical plane, and work on the subtler planes and more on the mental plane in the subjective realm. And that has not always been the case. I think sometimes we attribute, or I see a tribute being given to ancient cultures as being so more far advanced than we are, but that's not the case. He makes this clear when he's talking about the development. There were civilizations that developed the astral plane and created it. That was their role. Okay. But they're not the high point in civilization. We are at this point the high point. We are started working on the mental plane. We have more awareness. So we're now at a point where we can work on both levels. We can function in this world, which whatever the karma is, for whatever purpose you came back here for, you've got a job to do, whatever that may be. But you can also, you have the capacity on the mind, because it doesn't have to be engaged fully in anything you do down here. It's not that demanding. Okay. You might get into a job that has a lot of demands, which is, then we call it a lot of signal, and doesn't make much space for or a lot of noise and doesn't make much space for the signal, but you still have it. It can still loom there. And if you get connected, like he's talking about here, then things start happening that you're not even aware of. So they're just happening on other levels of who you are. Well, you're putzing around here, doing whatever you've got to do. It's making that connection is the most important thing. But he says you can function in both realms. And the master confers with some of his senior disciples as to the advisability of admitting the aspirant within the group aura of blending his vibration with that of the group. Then, if decision is arrived at, for the space of 2 years, a senior disciple acts as the intermediary betwixt the master and the newly accepted aspirant. He works with the new disciple, stepping down, if I might so express it, the vibration of the master so as to accustom the disciples' bodies to the higher increased rate. He impresses the disciple's mind via his ego with the group's plans and ideals, and he watches his reaction to life occurrences and opportunities. He practically assumes pro tem the duties and position of the master. In other words, he's getting the vibration, his vibrations step up, but obviously the master's having to step down a little. That higher awareness has to be stepped down so you can absorb it and hopefully translate it effectively. At this time, the aspirant remains in ignorance of what has happened and is unaware of his subjective contacts. So again, take note. You might not think things are happening, but he's telling you over and over again that there's all of this subjective stuff that's going on that you may not be aware of. But he, however, will recognize in himself 3 things. There's an increased mental activity. This at first will give him much trouble, and he will feel as if he were losing in mind control instead of gaining it. But this is only a temporary condition, and gradually he will assume command. Now, increased responsiveness to ideas and increased capacity to vision the plan of the hierarchy. This will make him, in the early stages, fanatical to a degree. He will be continually swept off his feet with new ideals, new isms, new modes of living, new dreams for race betterment. He will take up one cult after another as they seem to make possible the coming of the millennium. After a time, he regains his poise, assumes control of his life. He works at his own job and carries forward his contribution to the activity of the whole to the best of his ability. That's after you get over the Chela fever that they talk about, being all excited about this, and you got to tell everybody about it, and your mind is racing off in a number of different directions, probably connecting with little lower mind ideas, because those are the ones you have. And then this comes along, and how can we apply this, et cetera, et cetera. And then you settle in with it. So, increased psychic sensitivity. This is both an indication of growth and at the same time a test. He's apt to be taken in by the allurements of the psychic powers. He will be tempted to sidetrack his efforts from specialized service to the race into exploitation of the psychic powers and their use for self-assertion. The aspirant has to grow in all parts of his nature, but until he can function as the soul, the psyche consciously, and with the use of cooperative intelligence, the lower powers must be quiescent. They can only be safely used by advanced disciples and initiates. They are weapons and instruments of service to be used by them, used in the 3 worlds by those who are still tied by the law of rebirth to those worlds. Those who have passed through the great liberation and have occultly crossed the bridge have no need to employ the powers inherent in the lower sheaths. Yeah, because they don't need to take on a form. They can use the infallible knowledge of the intuition and the illumination of the principle of light. So that's where they're going to get their information. There's much apprehension in people's minds as to how a master lets an accepted disciple become aware that he is accepted. An impression is abroad that he is told so, and that an interview is accorded wherein the master accepts him and starts him to work. Such is not the case. The occult law holds good in discipleship as initiation, and the man goes forward blindly. He hopes, but he does not know. He expects that it may be so, but no tangible assurance is given. From a study of himself, perhaps he has reached the status of accepted disciple. He therefore acts on that assumption, and with care he watches his acts, guards his words, controls his thoughts, so that no overt act, unnecessary word, or unkind thoughts will break the rhythm which he believes has been set up. He proceeds with his work, but intensifies his meditation. He searches his motives. He seeks to equip his mental body. He sets before himself the ideal of service and seeks ever to serve. And then, when he is so engrossed in the work on hand that he has forgotten himself, suddenly one day he sees one who has for so long seen him. This may come in two ways: in full waking consciousness, or by the registering of the interview on the physical brain as it has been participated in during hours of sleep. But accompanying this recognition of the event by the disciple will come certain other recognitions. The event is recognized as fact past all controversy. No doubt remains in the disciple's mind. There is recognition and inhibition on the disciple's part to mention the happening to anyone. Months or years may slip away before the disciple will mention it, and then only to those who are recognized as disciples or some fellow work under the same group influence, whose right it is to know and whose right is sanctioned by the master of the group. Certain factors governing the master's relation to the disciple are gradually recognized and being increasingly to govern the disciple's life. He recognizes that his points of contact with his master are governed by group emergency and need, and deal with his group service. It gradually dawns on him that his master is only interested in him insofar as his ego can be used in service. Okay. I think this was something that the Theosophical Society lost that focus, and was part of the destruction of the unification between this work and that work. He begins to realize that his master works with his soul, and that it is his ego, therefore, which is in rapport with the master and not the personal self. His problem, therefore, becomes increasingly clear, and this is the problem of all disciples, is to keep the channel of communication between the soul and the brain via the mind, so that when the master seeks to communicate, he can do so at once and easily. Sometimes a master has to wait weeks before he can get his disciple's ear, for the channel upward is closed and the soul is not in rapport with the brain. This is especially true of the early stages of discipleship. So, and I suppose in some respect, part of this defines the relationship that he had with Alice Bailey, in terms of the channel of communication and how it was developed. And I think he indicated towards the end, it was just like a real easy flow of the words, because that channel was probably so well developed with her that things got so much easier over time. He finds, after he's waited for these weeks, and that's number A, this is number B. He finds that it is he who shuts the door in the majority of cases through lower psychism, physical disability, lack of mind control, and he therefore discovers that he has to work constantly and ceaselessly with his lower self. he finds that one of the first things he has to do is to learn to discriminate between his own soul's vibrations, the vibration of the group of disciples with which he is associated, and the vibration of the master. All three are different, and it is easy to confuse them, especially at first. It is a safe rule for aspirants to assume when they contact a high vibration and stimulus that it is their own soul contacting them. The master in the heart, and not run off with the idea that the master is endeavoring to reach them. And that's why I'm saying some of these people who channel this person or that person or whatever are very well in that particular arena right there, where they it's their own soul contacting them and communicating with them. And but they do not identify it that way. They identify it as a separate entity. I think that's pretty much what some of these, I mean, because they have another name for the individual that they are channeling, you know, it's Seth or it's this or it's that. But I think generally that is their own higher self, probably. And a lot of that information relates to here and generalized living here. So when you read it, and it does not necessarily have gone up that full level to the triad. It's talking about the quality of life here more often than not, I think. He also finds that it is not the habit of masters to flatter or to make promises to their disciples. Okay. They are too busy and too wise, nor do they trouble themselves to tell their disciples that they are destined for high office or that they are intermediaries and that the hierarchy is depending upon them. Ambition, love of power, and self-sufficiency, which characterizes many mental types, test out the struggling aspirant, and he gets from his personality all that he needs in that line. These qualities delude him and lead him astray, forcing him onto a pedestal from which eventually he must descend. The masters say nothing to feed their pride in their disciples, nor do they speak words to them which could foster in their chelas the spirit of separativeness. The disciple soon finds out that masters are not easily accessible. They are busy men, ill able to spare even a few moments in which to communicate with the disciple, and only in emergencies, in the case of a beginner on the path of discipleship, do the masters expend the necessary energy with which to get in rapport. With old and tried disciples, the contacts are more frequent, being more easily achieved, and bearing more rapid results. It should be remembered, however, that the newer the disciple, the more he demands attention and considers he should have it. The old and more experienced servers seek to fulfill their obligations and carry forward their work with as little contact with masters as possible. They seek to save the master's time and frequently consider an interview with the master as demonstrating failure on their part and producing therefore regret that they have had to take the master's precious time and force him to use his energy in order to safeguard the work from error and the disciple perhaps from harm. The aim of every high disciple is to carry out his work and be in rapport with the spiritual force center, which is his group, and thus in steady touch with the master without interviews and phenomenal contacts. Many only expect to contact their master once a year, usually at the time of the full moon in May. Well, we know whose full moon that is. That's the Buddha's full moon. He finds also that the relationship between master and disciple is governed by law, and there are definite stages of contact and grades in the desired rapport. These can be enumerated but cannot be enlarged. The stage wherein a disciple is contacted by the master through another chela on the physical plane. This is the stage of little chelaship. The stage wherein a higher disciple directs the chela from the egoic level. This is a stage called a chela in the light. The stage wherein, according to necessity, the master contacts the chela through a vivid dream experience, a symbolic teaching, a using of a thought form of the master, a contact in meditation, and a definite remembered interview in the master's ashram. This is definitely the stage of accepted disciple. The stage wherein, having shown his wisdom and work and his appreciation of the master's problem, the disciple is taught how, in emergencies, to attract the master's attention and thus draw on his strength and knowledge and advice. This is an instantaneous happening and practically takes none of the master's time. This stage has the peculiar name of a chela on the thread or the sutratma. The stage wherein, having shown his wisdom and work and his appreciation of the master's problems, the disciple is taught how, in emergencies, to attract the master's attention and thus draw on his strength and knowledge and advice. This is an instantaneous happening, practically takes none of the master's time. This stage has the peculiar name of, oh, did I read that totally twice? Probably did. Yeah, chela on the thread. The stage where he's permitted to know the method whereby he may set up a vibration and a call, which will entitle him to an interview with the master. This is only permitted to those trusted chelas who can be depended upon not to use the knowledge for anything except the need of work. No personality reason or distress would prompt them to use it. At this stage, the disciple is called one within the aura. And the stage where the disciple can get his master's ear at any time, he is in close touch always. This is a stage where the chela is definitely being prepared for an immediate initiation, or having taken initiation, is being given specialized work to do in collaboration with his. At this stage, he is described as one within his master's heart. There is a later stage of a still closer identification where there's a blending of the lights, but there is no adequate paraphrase of the term used to cover the name. The 6 stages above mentioned have been paraphrased for Occidental understanding and must in no way be considered as translations of the ancient terms. So before I continue on, questions, comments? Silent? I would imagine, considering there have to have been more students that have moved up a little bit. And I don't know what the number of masters is, but they must be really overworked, you know, and have a heavy demand, because the volume of people who have gone through this in comparison with the very early stages they indicate is certainly the numbers compounded. And that the simplicity of some of the earlier masters, what it took to make the graduation was very simplistic, and it gets harder all the time because we're dealing with more information, more awareness. or advancement, if you will. But having had this material laid out, again, one doesn't have to look far to get the answers you need and the process with this material. Yeah. It's a real, I mean, it's a full education by the time you go through all of his books. Not much more you can ask for.
I thought I heard somewhere in there, it just kind of struck me as interesting. I can't find it now, but it was probably a few pages back, where is it the aspirant or the disciple? They're not really sure where they are in the stage, but they think they're somewhere. So they kind of start cleaning up their act, thinking that they're there, and that kind of progresses them forward because I just found that kind of interesting.
Right. Anybody you know?
Probably a little bit of myself.
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, you've gotten a positive affirmation within yourself, at least, that drives yourself to clean up your act even more, or whatever, however you want to put it. Yeah. So. Well, there's a lot of information here. This is a very long rule. There's no way we're getting through this one. Goes to page 219.
But the soul at that level isn't teaching you about what's going on in the spiritual triad above. It's giving you what you have gotten to do it, right? So this is the difference in the vibration that we're talking about a little bit in there.
Well, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't really have good words for that.
No, but in other words, early on, the soul is just wanting recognition, for starters. And we can be talking about eons of time, because he indicates somewhere in all of this material that in the earlier stages, I mean, the soul never looks in this direction. It indicates it needs the incarnations, but it pays no attention to them, because there's so much work that needs to be done before it can even gain any attention from the soul that would be warranted. So I mean, it never turns its direction in this direction. It's looking upward was the indication of what I read. And so, I mean, you go for long eons, probably, if you think back to the beginning of where this relationship and the incarnating relationship is, for start, to begin with. So there's eons of time there when it has no interest. And like it's often been said, until you've got an integrated personality, it's not going to really be interested in having any real interaction with you of any sort, simply because it's dangerous to you if you haven't got all of those lower bodies under control and focused and operating as one unit. Because the energy that you might get from the soul itself would only strengthen the uncoordination And then you'd be working a few more lifetimes to undo that, to get back to a coordinated unit again. Or to get one in the first place, because you wouldn't have had one. So it doesn't even want to throw a charge into you or make that connection early on. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was really thinking about the recognizing the differences of the vibrations, and it's a
Who's
lot there.
Who's recognizing the differences?
Um,
You down here or the soul up there? Which, where you-
So it was on one side, he finds that one of the first things he has to do is to learn to discriminate between his own soul's vibration, the vibration of the group of disciples with whom he is associated, and the vibration of the master.
Right. Yeah, so that means the you that's down here
Right.
is the one that needs to figure out where this is coming from, because initially any attitude that would be higher than his normal thinking, he could attribute to any advanced being. And that's been, I think a lot of that's been burned out with this work, but it was very apparent and still relatively fresh when he wrote these books of what happened with the Theosophical Society, because they were, the master says this and the master says that, and probably the I.A.B. Society was like that, and the great majority of them, because this is all egocentric.
And he mentions that pretty in good detail in Esoteric Psychology, actually.
Yeah.
He also mentions the Rosicrucians doing the same thing.
Yeah, so unless you're, well, until you're past that, in a sense, I guess is what I would say, because it will be the natural direction to go, because you're looking for the pull. There's got to be a pull from the soul. In other words, there's the desire to go up. There's a desire to have a recognition, but we've got a lot of layers of brain that will feed us a lot of information that is not necessarily accurate. We have a wide imagination, which can be fed very easily. Okay, so
yeah.
And so there's all kinds of that was really prevalent around Blavatsky and that whole time period, which was what, the turn of the century and coming into this century. So, and there was so much phenomena, and I mean, she got a lot of attention, but a lot of it's because she pulled some real phenomenalistic events, and stuff, and her comments even were way out of the norm, and so there was really, excuse me, a lot of people to woo and wonder, and stuff like that. So the head goes, the imagination grows, and then her concept of the masters came out at that time, and talking about them, because there hadn't really been a lot of information directed to the West at that time. And so she was applying it in the West, and then the society itself, because I think they got, they truly were the ones, the master says this and the master says that. I didn't run into those people in my lifetime with groups that I was involved with, because I was doing the Bela material and they already were reading that out. I know that the oh, what are the Masonic, whatever, because there is a revitalization of that meant to be occurring that DK had wanted with, and changing some of the rituals and whatever else. And I know in that seating format because I think once or twice a year, people who are not the members can come and observe or whatever, and sit through one. So there were always chairs, empty chairs there for the masters. Okay. But that was, that's about as far, I think, as that stuff goes now. You know, it's not a master's worship. They're not. Respect, yes. Appreciation, yes, but not this worshiping them and adulation and so on and so forth. And I've never heard anybody in my world of dealing with this, which has been 50 years, the master says this or he says that. But I think that was very prevalent in the Theosophical Society and the other groups who popped up during that period of time. So is that part of what you were talking about?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, and he says, you know, that causes problems, that attitude in a lot of ways.
Bad, yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of problems. It's
You're trying to get to the soul. This is really about the soul, you know, and
yeah, and and the thing is, that's an obstruction because you're looking at the concept of a master or something. It obstructs getting there.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's probably filling one's head with imaginary stuff of what this illustrious master or whatever is supposed to be or have accomplished, or I mean, you know, you can fill your head with all kinds of expectations that may not be realistic
Right.
about that status and what that status represents, when they're not necessarily true. But it would stop your own journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because everybody's got to do it themselves. You know, that's the only thing that counts. Nobody can bonk you on the head and say, you're chosen and you're chosen. It's, you choose yourself and decide you're going to take that journey, and then you give it your all, you know.
Yeah.
And and by that, part of your all is whatever your karma is here at the same time as you're making that journey. When I say give your all, but it's the building of your body, of which you've got your physical. Now it's your subtler bodies that need to be built. That takes you up to the next triad. Okay. I mean, that's the process. Nobody can do that but you. And it's not done overnight unless you're recapitulating because you've already done it somewhere else, in an earlier incarnation or something. And you can't fake it. You know, it's either happening or it's not happening. So, and you can't worry over it a lot and give it a whole lot of thought. You just do the best you can do, keep your attention focused, so on and so forth. But and just trust that you're on the right track. But you're never going to know when it's gonna kick in, so to speak, with recognition. But if you understand that things go by law and that it will proceed once you've made that initial appeal, if you will, and kind of made a little connection, because it even, he talks about with the triad after the third, he says, even with that atmic level, which if it's the finest of that thin line of light, but makes that connection, that's all you need, because that's the start. And so it's building that bridge, that anachrona, making that initial contact, which is all subjective. Once you get the connection, then that line will become active. Okay. And that's just all. And nobody can do that for you. And trying to figure out what it all means ahead of time is senseless.
Mhm.
You know, because it's a process of being. It's not figuring out what it's like or not like. Yeah. The only thing that counts is your own personal actions, and that's determined by your choices. The same for everybody.
When you start getting into like the group work, like all those members in that group have to be in alignment. I think he alluded to something in there on page, back on page 161, where he's talking about the conditions of the waters and the whirlpool, the cesspool of selfishness, and that you have many disciples who have achieved a fair measure of self-control and of personal disinterestedness. They're not the victims of personality, desire, and aims, but are comparatively free from the whirlpool of selfish tendencies. But their astral bodies are again and again swept into a state of agitation by the group for in which they work, become depressed, dissatisfied by the results that they achieve to fail or achieve. And it kind of goes into, I'm sensing that it's like others that are in that group that kind of still steer towards those selfish tendencies. They can throw the whole group off. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yeah, and I see this with limited group work that I see, and we're not talking about the Bailey material now, but just there are people who really want to work in a group.
Mhm.
Okay, they really believe in that. I'm not a strong believer in that way down at these lower levels, because once you've made some of these connections in that soul connection, then that's a different ballgame.
Mhm.
But if you're down where you're predominantly, your group is predominantly functioning on their astral,
Right.
okay, and now and there's decision making, and you're not going to get a consensus of 12 people
Right.
to all do it the same way. You just aren't. They're all coming there with their own axe to grind, maybe their own history of this group,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. So when they're not meeting in view of each other, they're backbiting somewhere else. Okay.
Right.
And they decide, okay, well, I don't like the way this is, the choice of how this is going to be done, because I want to see it done a different way. And that's kind of what he's implying, some of that in there. Okay, so I'm not a real supporter of trying to force the people who are functioning on that physical astral plane with no advanced development on the mental plane to
Mhm.
be trying to do group work, because all they do is fight each other,
Right.
and backbite and get nothing done.
Yeah. Well, and that could really significantly limit the individual growth that has to occur before you can even really get there. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, once you get a group who have, if you got a group of people here who've done the third initiation, for
Mhm.
example, then they can go in and they can start to work, because once you've made that connection, you have moved now into the realms where you're going to do a lot of your development in the formless realms of the spiritual triad. Your inclusiveness and your ability is just expanded beyond belief compared to what, I mean, look at the little kindergarten kids. Okay, and kind of imagine it, because it's not far from that in terms of one wants to play this way and one wants to do it that way. And they get a little older, they've just got a stronger emotional grip on how they want it, and they can get angrier and so on and so forth. So there's that stage. And he tried groups. And early on, there might be some good ones now, because he's 100 years later, literally 100. And yeah, they were working on it before 1923, but I mean, we're coming right up on almost 100 years, and you've probably got some groups that are more, that the greater percentage of them, or almost all of them, are advanced to that level. So they're actually really working on those levels where they don't have all of that astral functioning and physical, for that matter. But otherwise it's hard. I mean, you have it all the time in any kind of group, period. Very few groups are you going to get where they're really working for a goal, and they would self-sacrifice themselves in terms of their little ideas to go for a bigger goal.
Right.
Because they are going to be working their chart. Let's put it that way. That's
Yeah.
you know, and their chart says, boom, this is the way things happen. And that one's chart says, that's the way this is going to happen. And, you know, so there's clashes either right up front or undercurrents. Very difficult until there's a certain level of advancement. So you've probably seen it.
No. Of course.
The number of
It's
people
like,
you work
it's
with.
like, it's a weekly occurrence at work.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, because you know, you can probably somewhat gauge where you might think that individuals within a group might be, dependent on like how they proceed in those groups.
Mhm.
If they're willing to and they're constantly making sacrifices and things like that of their own personal wills for the greater good of the group, that's probably a pretty good indicator that from a mental capacity, they're a little bit more advanced than the others in the group. The unfortunate truth is that
You got the other guys.
those are the ones with the good ideas that you actually want moving forward. And 9 times out of 10, they're kind of knocked down because
Sure.
the others are like, yeah, no, we got to do it this way.
Yeah. No, they're not there yet. And yeah, so I mean, it's really, and as far as having a consensus instead of a leader, I mean, that doesn't work any
Right.
better at that point, because then you probably get no real I mean, there has to be, I know the Japanese do consensus, but you know that the majority, there's a leader somewhere there laying out the initial plan, and the other ones in pecking order go along, you know. So nope, it's
So like what happens before they get to that consensus taking too? Like,
yeah.
You know, is there some manipulation and coercion going on before they even get to that stage so that they have the consensus when they have to take the consensus? Who knows?
Well, the chances are in that society, because they recognize and value age, etc. That, yeah, there's a lot of just given
Mhm.
consensus that one understands, because
Right.
what the younger ones just should join in because they're learning, and this is their education. And after they've had 40 years of that, they're on the top, and they expect the other ones underneath who
Of
haven't
course.
got,
Yeah.
no, but it's, again, like I said, it's real hard to do group at that level, but the journey that you ultimately take, that only you can take, is the one he's talking about here,
Mhm.
in terms of your subjective and all of that. You can put that together, and you don't need anybody else around to do that. Like I said, these books are great guidance, and I would suggest anybody who's interested in that journey just hangs with this stuff and goes through everything and builds that consciousness in, because that is where this will lead. When your consciousness and this are, that's built into your consciousness, and it is part of your truth, then that will be the procession. Not that it's going to happen in one lifetime or anything like that, but everything you build is collective. This is the one thing you do take with you. So, so it's worthwhile. And nobody can stop you from that, if that's what you want to do, is to focus and go and start that journey. You can have people harassing you, in your world or whatever, if they don't think that, blah, blah, blah. But basically no one can stop you if that's the journey you choose to take at this point and work for it. So. And he does, Moria will say every once in a while in one of his books that every so often you're going to take a break, because you need it, and you need to know when you need to take the break, to let everything settle, and because you can overfeed yourself, so to speak, and you're going to have problems. So, because this is rhythms and cycles.
Right.
And generally that rhythm, it appears, probably goes right in, coincides with winter to spring to midsummer to fall, just like the growth season that you see with plants. And so when in cosmic consciousness, they see that experience happen, and the dates, there's a degree of uniformity for the most part in the timing for individuals. Usually that stuff comes in the early, works its way. Its inception comes at Christmas, but you're not going to see any of it until March or thereabouts, and it goes to couple months at the most. And he has an average age group that might change. That might have come down a little, but that was 35. I think they were tagging some of that also to Christ and his age, but that the current evaluations that Bucke made in that book 100 years ago was that age range was still in those 33 to 38 or something like that for that particular one. And I would say that the reasoning for that is because for the most part, that is when the physical body has had the potential to develop those subtler bodies. Because first of all, the physical has to grow and hit a certain point. Then you've got, I think at 21, a recapitulation, picking up where you left off last time. And then the physical in its more subtle levels continues to grow and has to have grown to a certain point before that can happen. You know, those key points can happen. So we just haven't focused on that yet or really understand the subtlety of all that, to realize that that growth is still there and that those opportunities are there. I would expect this next age, this will all surface again and be pretty clear. Unless we're all hooked up with chips and don't have, you know, and don't have the brain apparatus anymore.
Lord, I hope not.
Yeah, well.
Your concept.
Well, they're talking about it.
No, I know.
They think that that's gonna, well, I don't know what they originally really have the true intent of thinking and understanding, because they know what all this material is too. It's out there for everybody. So that's probably, that's in rule 5 is where we've left off.
174, I think.
Yeah. So that's where that is at this point in time. And we've talked before about, I won't be available for the foreseeable future with this, but you guys may be choosing to go on with it and read it. And I know there's other people who watch these videos, so they might appreciate that. So. Anyway, any other comments or questions with this material or?
Not at this current moment for me.
Okay.
But like, you know, the way it goes, 2 weeks from now.
Right, sure. Well, you've expanded your consciousness 2 weeks from now. That's what this material does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why anybody can take this journey and choose to do it.
Yeah.
You know, and the material is there and the ability to expand your consciousness is built right into this material.
Mhm.
So.
No doubt.
At the very least, certainly enables you to look at everything through a much different lens than you're typically kind of programmed to do
Been
growing
brought
up. So
yeah, but the interesting thing about it is it's, I don't want to say logical, but in many respects, we're still dealing with logic here. But there is a foundation of truth that settles in with one's mind and starts to rework things in a positive way. So, you know, your results usually of living here improve.
And they say that, you know, they always mention, or he always mentions, you know, in the world, but not of it. And getting to that is a challenge.
Of course it is. That's the big deal.
Yeah. Because there's a lot to confuse us and sidetrack us going on, and even looking at other people and people, we and Tom and I and these other guys have had these conversations where we have a lot of people that we've respected over the years and are thankful for where, they've gotten us. And so when it comes time to be in the world and not of it, when you're still looking at those individuals, it's like, well, we're moving, the turtle's moving past now, I guess, at that point. And it's hard there's still a lot of confusion. It's interesting.
Well, you can certainly appreciate other human beings for their value.
Right. Yeah.
But that doesn't conflict with being in the world, but not of it, is what I'm saying.
Right. I understand, but not just them. It's just that there's always a lot of pull back into it, I guess.
Sure.
So getting to the point of on a full-time basis, and making it more constant or more long-term meditation type of,
Yeah.
it's a challenge, and that is a journey.
Yeah. And, and you shouldn't demand so much out of yourself, because this is not a fast journey. It really is not. They talk about the eons of lifetimes that one goes through to make this journey from the very beginning to where it's going to be. And it's not a fast journey. So you really can't put yourself on a demanding fast track. It's not healthy.
Right. No doubt. I mean, getting comfortable is a challenge in it too.
Yeah. Well, it's a battle. That's what he said. There's the battle, and there's the point where, you're making the shift, but you don't have much to work with on the shift. And so obviously the pull is back the other way, and it's confusing. And what can you have nothing practical to show anybody, nothing tangible.
Yeah.
Other than they might find they get along with you better than they did before, or something like that. But it can't, yeah, and part of the problem is, I mean, the focus here is, okay, there are masters. All right. And they came from somewhere. They came from the ground up. And so there's the expectation that this is the model of where I should be going, which granted it is, except that it's not going to happen in a lifetime. And you're living in a world that expects you only get one lifetime. So there's the contradistinction right there between, well, I'm working on something that's going to take me, eons of time to do. Duh. People are looking at you, well, you should be concerned about rising up the corporate ladder this time. You only live once, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So, so you're living in that kind of world at the same time. I am sure that some of the individuals who accomplished this had lifetimes where they were monks or nuns or whatever, where they could just spend their whole life doing that. Okay. Not having all the other demands that that life in the year 800 was demanding or something. There have to be a number of individuals who did those kind of retreats, if you will.
Yeah, became hermits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And I know that. Is it Matt? How do you say Hilarion? Is that how you say Master Hilarion, or is it Hilarion?
Hilarion.
They say he became a hermit in his previous, after he was Paul, the Apostle Paul. He was a hermit after that in the next life.
Well, and yeah, and so, I mean, you have to be able to go off and be alone at some point when you hit those subtler realms, because the vibrations that are here will draw you right back at all times when you hear them. Yeah. If you're immersed in them all the time, is what I'm saying. You know, so sure, there's lifetimes where they're out and quiet, but still in form, because they're probably drawing something's happening while they're in form that needs to be happening.
It's very interesting to start thinking in terms of lifetimes instead of weeks or
Right.
months or
Yeah.
a year.
Yeah, you're in a long-term goal now if you choose
Yeah.
this. But you're also in a day-to-day world. And the expectation is not that you're gonna give up all the responsibilities that you have in a day-to-day world. You know, in other words, you're not ditching a lot of other beings that are in your world to accomplish your own goal at their expense. If you have responsibilities, then you take care of the responsibilities. And you do this at the same time. And it can be done because you know that physically you can do a whole lot of things, whether you're thinking or not. In other words, you're mental, and you can be doing a whole lot of things where your mind is thinking something else. So your mind has that capacity. Doesn't have to be physically present like your hands do all the time. So it can be doing more than one thing.
Yeah, DK even says that, and we have had this conversation, and Tom has mentioned this before, that a disciple can get a lot more done in a very short amount of time than somebody else.
Yeah, because if that disciple is not being constantly triggered by his astral plane and to respond to a whole lot of things that probably aren't even in the environment, but he's still okay. You can be more focused. And if you can focus on whatever you're doing without a lot of distractions, you can get it done faster. And you've got a clearer mind and a clearer emotional realm that's not, mainly making you a twirling dervish.
Yeah,
So,
good stuff.
yeah, but basically, like I said, this is each individual's journey. Nobody but them can make the commitment, and nobody can stop them if they don't want to be stopped. Yeah, but you're self-appointed on this one. It's not that somebody comes and says, okay,
You have
can,
been chosen.
yeah, this you have been chosen business, kind of thing, where I think there was an illusion, at least when I started this material, it was, and certainly prior to that with the Theosophical Society, because they were choosing their friends, to be this and have accomplished that. And, it doesn't work that way. Every human being has this capacity to make this choice, because they're all given the equipment, because our physical body is the equipment. It doesn't matter what race, creed, color, whatever, all the words that they've used throughout history. It's not discriminatory that way.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's to us to use that equipment wisely.
Yes, which means that you need to try to keep it healthy.
Right.
So a lot of the current behavior out there disrupts this process
Mhm.
because of the, the damage or just the reoccurring trips to the astral plane. That builds that in, because the majority of those drugs are triggering that emotional realm. Yeah, no, there's a lot of efforts now to make this equipment dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now I've heard a lot about MDMA, not MDMA, but MEO, DMT. There's a drug that you hear a lot about going around, right? And a lot of the response that you would hear from people is that they were wrapped in love.
MDMA.
Yeah, and it triggers DMT, and then they've got this DMT stuff. But that's an astral. Is that right? That's astral?
Yeah, it also the French did research on that years ago, because it's been around for a while, and they had patients taken it once, and then they tested them 5 years later. It had burned the nerve endings, probably the receptors on, I believe it was, on the nerve endings. And 5 years later, that had not grown back. They had not grown back. They were permanently damaged. So that one does permanent damage to you also. And they're now considering using that as a drug for our psychiatrists to use on individuals.
But when you have that, I think when you have that feeling of love, and you have all that emotional rush, that's just all astral.
It's astral, but the real key to that is they retake the drug to recapture the feeling.
Because it's pleasant. Yeah.
Yeah, but understand what's implied there. Without the drug, they can't have the feeling. So it's the key for your soul development, and that consciousness is, prior to having worked your consciousness up to that level with the soul and have that union of that consciousness, you always had to be incarnated. Okay, afterwards you don't. And the same thing is that I'm saying here is, you need to take the drug to have that feeling. After you've hit those upper levels, you have that. Always, right. It's yours. Okay. Yeah, it's the continuing consciousness. And that's why I said I've known people where they'll turn around and they'll say, yeah, I got to that point, I could almost grasp it, but then I had to come back. But you see, they couldn't bring it back with them, because that is not continuing consciousness. That is going over and connecting with something that, if it's plants, then you're connecting with the stimulation from the plant kingdom. But you're not having that at will at any given time without the stimulant.
Right.
Okay. And so, so what I'm saying is the fact that the MDMA can make that, that feeling occur is one thing, but it's not the origin of when you're up at the top of that chart and you have connection, conscious connection with all of those energies that are inclusive. That's, I mean, they're two different things. One is a stimulant from a chemical or chemistry in a plant or whatever, but you have to have the reoccurring events. You have to keep taking this stuff to get there again. Totally different from the evolution. And I would expect that as you move up that chain, you're not, there's a different type of connection, as inclusive as it will be, because they've talked about the lesser veils, and pretty soon there's very little obstruction to your interacting with all of the energy that functions in that realm. But taking a plant stimulant or a chemical stimulant that functions on those lower realms, those lower two realms, that's where they're coming from, right? You're either coming from the physical level 7 with some of the chemistry, or the plant kingdom, who has synthesized some of the physical from the 7th in through the plant. I mean, that's how plants do, and they help break down the physical. And but it can't, it's not the same as what you're going to experience up on those upper levels. Totally different. Yeah.
You know, with some of that too, you have to probably going to sound a bit hypocritical here because I can't seem to give up caffeine, but you know, it does whatever it does, and you have to do more and more of it to get back to that same point over time. And so you're doing more damage to yourself by incurring that. So it's very, very dangerous concept. Donnie and I were talking a little bit about, you know, some of the research on medical usage and the legalization of some of these hallucinogens and things like that. And it's just such a dangerous concept to think.
Absolutely. Because
now it's making it in the minds of the masses, oh, this is now acceptable, so we can just go do it. It's just
right. No, it leads to some dysfunction in the physical unit that you've got here. And if this one is healthy, operational, you can do that. What we're talking about with this material, this is the piece of machinery that does it.
right.
You need this machinery to do it. Okay. But it is not done, it's done with full consciousness. It's not done through a stimulant.
Right.
Of some other kingdom that's got to come in here and no, it cancels out this journey.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is what happens. And so when you look at the earlier generations or civilizations, they're not taking this journey. They weren't on the mental plane for starters. But they are stimulating again with substances from the lower two realms.
Right.
Yeah.
Like ayahuasca and
That whether it was the Indians or whether it's somebody in Africa or somebody in China, or they've all got groups that did that. Okay. It's prevalent to humanity, but that's not this journey. This journey is, and I've asked other groups who seriously work with this material and have been working for decades. And wasn't too long ago, I asked, I said, you know, have you ever, I mean, because I had never known them to be having any interest in that. And he said, no, none of this is done with drugs. It's a heavy enough trip if you ever get there. That, yeah, that you don't need it. So anyway,
Yeah,
anything else, guys?
no, not for today.
Well, thanks for getting us this far.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Well,
thank
and you
very
guys
much.
can
we
do
wish
this.
you well on your journey, and
Thank you.
hopefully someday down the road you can join us again.
Yeah, I'll be around, but anyway, at this point, this is what it is. So, but you guys, you know, nothing stops you from pursuing this and keep going.
For sure.
Accept yourselves.
Can't stop the freight train now.
Yeah. So, I guess you can push the button whenever you're ready.
Okay,